Welcome to Breaking Doctrine, presented to you by the Combined Arms Doctrine Directorate at the Combined Arms Center at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. The views expressed here are those of the individual and do not represent the views of the Combined Arms Center, U.S. Army, or U.S. government.
Hello, I'm Major Chris Parker, and this podcast topic is defense support of civil authorities. With me today is Brigadier General John Rueger, Director of the Joint Staff, Kansas National Guard, Colonel Rich Creed, Director of the Combined Arms Doctrine Directorate, or CADD, Stephen Tennant, Assistant Professor at the Command and General Staff College, and joining us by phone from Fort Sam Houston is Mr. Robert Gonzales, Senior Domestic Operational Law Attorney, Office of the Staff Judge Advocate, U.S. Army North. Gentlemen, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me here.
Thank you.
Today we're discussing how the U.S. Army and National Guard support local, state, and federal authorities during domestic emergencies and natural disasters. Along with offense, defense, and stability operations, defense support of civil authorities, or DSCA, is an element of decisive action. However, it differs in several key areas, particularly the laws and authorities that govern U.S. forces operating within the homeland. Now, whether it be through civil unrest, the COVID-19 response, or operations along the U.S.-Mexico border, DSCA has taken center stage as of late. But before we get into that, Colonel Creed, if you could, start us off with some doctrinal background and a description of DSCA and the associated tasks.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. So we have a capstone doctrinal publication, an Army doctrinal publication, ADP 328, and it's titled Defense Support of Civil Authorities. We published the latest revision to that last summer. It's dated July of 2019. And it defines DSCA as the support provided by U.S. federal military forces, DoD civilians, DoD contract personnel, DoD component assets, and National Guard forces in response to requests for assistance from civil authorities for domestic emergencies, law enforcement support, and other domestic activities, or from qualifying entities for special events. We might get into what those are at some other point. There's 4 key tasks associated with the term DSCA. It's to provide support for domestic disasters, provide support for domestic chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear incidents, and to provide support for domestic civilian law enforcement agencies, and then finally provide other designated support, which is a catch-all for unforeseen circumstances that we may not write to directly in doctrine. One of the key distinctions is that DSCA consists of military operations conducted in the United States and in support of civil authorities. So as such, from a doctrinal perspective, and what people tend to look at most often is Compo 1, we call it, Component 1, U.S. Army Component 1. So the active duty forces don't tend to pay as much attention to this as the U.S. Army National Guard and the U.S. Army Reserve do because of the nature of the mission and the likelihood that they are to perform those missions in those various roles and responsibilities. And so the doctrine lays out essentially 4 broad pillars, and I think we'll get into that in a practical sense here. The first is the state and federal laws define how military forces support civil authorities. The second is civil authorities are in charge and military forces support them. The third is military forces depart when civil authorities are able to continue without that military support. And finally, military forces must document the costs of all of the direct and indirect support provided. Now, that may sound a little goofy being in doctrine, but it's a huge big deal because nothing's free.
Now, sir, thanks for that intro. And I want to kind of direct this next to Mr. Tennant with your background, because we discussed some of this before we started recording today. And those fundamentals that Colonel Creed just mentioned, can you give us some background on where those came from and how those were developed?
It was actually in the staffing of a previous version of this doctrine, which was FM 328 a number of years ago. And when it was vetted, it went out to a lot of different places for review. At one point, the list got up to 15 fundamentals. And so let's just say some judicious editorial effort was put into reducing it to the point where it's essentially unchanged from what you see there or what you heard there. And that was finally, National Guard Bureau finally came online and said, that's it, stick with it. And that's kind of the short story.
Now, why the money piece? That seems interesting to me. It stands out, the last fundamental that's on there. Can you give us some background there?
Everything that happens in a disaster response is reimbursable. DoD does not work for free. So if DoD is getting involved in a response, it's at the direction of FEMA, at the request of the state, under a presidential disaster declaration, and it's not free. Okay, it must be reimbursed by the people that we're supporting. Now, a lot of times that comes out of the disaster fund, and there's a cost share in the disaster fund between state and the federal resources that are applied. The state's usually paying 25% of all the costs associated with a disaster, and that can be, the president has some discretion on lowering that percentage, but generally that's the rule. So if you are in Wallace County, Kansas, population 1442, and you have a disaster and you get a response, at least 25% of that is being paid for by the good citizens of Wallace County, Kansas. All right? And that's sometimes a hard thing to do in a low economic area or a lightly populated rural area.
So I guess, people think about the cost of a response in terms of damages that have to be repaired and so forth, but you're talking about the cost of maintenance of the vehicles, fuel, the salaries of the soldiers that are mobilized and so forth. That's what we mean?
It depends, and that's part of the problem in this business. I often get asked, well, how does this work? And my first answer is, what zip code are you standing in? Because it really depends very much on state law, how states subdivide for political jurisdictions. Like in Kansas, for example, we have a water board that has a taxing jurisdiction, for example. And that matters. And every state does it differently. So you kind of have to have Mr. Gonzales as your best friend when you're working in this arena, because those authorities are significant. And who can tell you to do what is based on those authorities.
Well, sir, let's go ahead and talk about that response that you bring up. You kind of started us there. Can you walk us through kind of the broad overview of how a DSCA response operation would work from essentially the ground up?
Sure. First of all, if it's DSCA, there has to be something bad going on that's going to involve either the National Guard at the state level or federal forces at the national level. So 99.9% of the time, we're not having a conversation about the military in general in a disaster response unless it's a big, big disaster. Second, there are some things that are DSCA that you mentioned them, sir, the other support, other as required. So let me take a minute and just review those, because these things are kind of outside of the everyone hears DSCA and they start thinking about disaster response, but there's a lot of categories that are outside of that. So for example, wildland firefighting support. Wildland firefighting support, there is somebody tasked with that every year, and that is not handled under the Stafford Act, which is the primary legislation for disaster response. It's handled under the Economy Act in a memorandum of agreement between the Department of the Interior, the Department of Agriculture, and the Department of Defense. So it's reimbursable under the Economy Act on an interdepartmental memo for DoD forces to get mobilized when called upon to go fight fires. Okay, and that means the costs of everything are reimbursed, not just the incremental costs. So you're paying for the fuel, the food, etc. You're also paying for pay and benefits for every single soldier that's mobilized that's getting reimbursed back to DoD. It's everything. The protection of critical infrastructure, there are, without getting into too much detail, there are instances where the National Guard and or the Army might be employed with critical infrastructure considerations. And that's ongoing, and it has nothing to do with a disaster response. And it's also complex because 85% of the critical infrastructure in this country is privately owned or public-private partnership, and the federal government has nothing to do with it, but has a responsibility to protect it. Community assistance. Now, that's people like, if you were going to march in the Veterans Day Parade in Leavenworth, Kansas on November 11th, that is technically a DSCA event. Flyovers at ball games, color guards, band performances. Also, there are some places in the country where Army medevac helicopters and Guard medevac helicopters are under memorandums of agreement to provide support. State and local events, national events, and in this case, we're talking about supporting security efforts and in preparedness for things like the Olympics, the Super Bowl, political conventions, the inauguration, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And there's usually a DOD element that's involved in that, and there's usually quite a bit of planning effort that goes into it. And then all of these things are usually have somebody else who's in charge. DOD is just supporting that somebody. So, for example, a national security event, typically the Secret Service is the lead federal agency, and we're just providing them some sort of support or another that's within DOD's capabilities, and it's on a reimbursable basis. Nothing's free.
Now, let's take a look at, I guess, the micro level, and we'll work our way up. Let's say a small town in Wallace County, Kansas, has a flood, and it rapidly grows beyond the means for the local community to manage. What's the framework in the response? What's that look like from there? How does it build up?
Okay, so just from a overall macro process point of view, we have the National Incident Management System, which is sort of managed and directed by FEMA.
Otherwise known as NIMS?
NIMS, correct. And as a subsidiary of that, you have the National Response Framework, which is a structure for how we do it and what capabilities are brought to bear. And Incident Command System, which is how you manage it. And all of those things are related to Presidential Policy Directives 5 and 8, which dictate this is how we're going to do it. And they're also related to the Stafford Act, ultimately, which is the legislation for this sort of thing. But everything starts local, no matter what. Everything starts local. So if Wallace County, Kansas has something bad happen, the first responders are the police, probably the sheriff and the police, maybe in Sharon Springs, and maybe their EMS for the county, because that's what they have, right? Yeah. Sharon Springs is the county seat of Wallace, Kansas.
So who do they then call next when the police and fire say this is beyond us?
We can't do it anymore. So Sharon Springs is out of Schlitz, and they're going to call the county emergency manager, and they're going to mobilize county resources. Okay, and then once the county is out of resources to apply to the problem, they're going to look around and employ mutual aid. They're going to request help from their surrounding counties, for example, to bring resources in to help. And those are governed by mutual aid agreements, intergovernmental mutual aid agreements that specify in advance, if we have a fire and we don't have enough firefighters, we're going to call you and you're going to respond, and we're going to reimburse you. And here's the rate at which we're going to reimburse you, and they've pre-negotiated all of that. It's all already written down in a legal agreement. An example of that, for example, 3-4 years ago now, there was a large apartment complex that caught fire in Overland Park, Kansas. It was a 33-alarm fire. They brought fire trucks from as far away as Lawrence, Kansas. It never got managed outside of the city. No county involvement, no state involvement, and it's a large incident. There was a lot of damage that occurred, but it was all managed by the city emergency management function with 33 alarms rung under mutual aid.
Okay, now, so I see that this is all county by county, city by city with these compacts. When do we bring in, or when does the National Guard, for example, when do they get called in, and how's that work?
Let me walk you through that next step. So now the county is out of resources. They're going to turn to the governor, next level, next political subdivision up, and they're going to ask for help. And the governor is probably already knowing something is going on in Wallace County because the state EOC is monitoring it, and they're going to start responding with a disaster declaration and the application of state resources to help Wallace County. Now, they may take based on analysis, they may take a decision that says, we need to send some National Guard folks in to support them. That'll be a state level decision based on a requirement that comes in from the incident commander on the ground for resources. And then they will make that decision at the state level and deploy National Guard forces at that point. But typically that's going to happen after they've deployed other resources, state fire resources, state police, state social service, state engineering resources, anything that the state has, contracted resources, anything that they have that can be applied to solving the problem, they'll do that. Kind of at the state level, the National Guard, depending on what it is sort of the last resource applied because they cost money and you got to mobilize people. You got to bring them on to state active duty. You have to pay them.
And I want to turn this over to General Rueger.
I think it's important to note that, and that's a good point to note that, yes, the Guard should be a last resort in a lot of sense just because of the cost factor. But also, if you think about it, if the Guard gets put into a particular position where they're going to go into a community and do X, Y, and Z, there may be a contractor that can do X, Y, and Z that you're taking maybe money away from too by employing the Guard. Now, at the end of the day, those are the things that are being discussed, at the state level to make the right decision on when's the right time to employ the Guard. And there is a flash to bang aspect of it too that we do have to mobilize. We can put a few on ground quickly, but to get a substantial force, depending upon the size of the event, it does take some time to mobilize. So all that has to be weighed into that decision making.
So now we've got the state National Guard involved. Now, if this crisis or disaster, expands beyond their capability, what's next? Can we talk about the Emergency Management Assistance Compact? How does that work?
That is precisely what's next. So they're still watching Wallace County. They understand that they need more resources, or they might need a specific resource that the state of Kansas doesn't have. Okay. There is this thing called the Emergency Management Assistance Compact, and it is actually statutory. It's based on legislation. It started in the southeast United States, and they came to an agreement that they were going to share resources in hurricane season. Okay, it really started with an agreement to share law enforcement resources in hurricanes so that the state police in Alabama could go help out in Florida, and they would be given appropriate authority and jurisdiction and indemnification if something went wrong, and vice versa. And then they expanded that to other kinds of resources other than just the police. And eventually that spread nationwide. And eventually Congress got in the act in 1996 and passed enabling legislation that the word that I sparked on when I reread it was consent. Congress consents to the states doing this. So now states, all 50 states have done it, have enacted legislation that joins the Emergency Management Assistance Compact, and that compact is a system for sharing resources, and it's like mutual aid, but on a larger level. So if I need a urban search and rescue team for Sharon Springs, and Kansas doesn't have one, but there's one in Omaha, Nebraska, we can exercise an EMAC and bring that team in to Sharon Springs, you see. And we don't have to worry about how they're notified, how they're indemnified, how they're paid, because that's already been pre-coordinated, pre-arranged, and it's enacted by the state legislatures. The framework has been enacted and adopted as law by every state legislature involved. The National Guard, and sir, maybe you want to comment on this, the National Guard uses EMAC a lot. And they have an annual conference, for example, when they're planning for hurricane season on National Guard and EMAC that they do every year.
That's correct. Every year, March, there is a conference where, all the all the states get together, National Guard representation gets together, and discuss and bring in what capabilities a state may need or what capabilities a state may offer to another state. So this is a way to really build a set of informal agreements from a National Guard perspective that can be executed upon by the states. Once they leave that conference and go back to the state, then working back with their own emergency management functions and the governor's office, being able to then tie that bow together to say, hey, we've got X capability that we can offer up, or we have Y capability that we may need. So the way it works is, we look at what's the worst day in, and I'm speaking Kansas here as an example. What's the worst day in Kansas look like for us who use maybe a multi-hazard event, or for instance, multiple tornadoes that cut a pretty wide swath across some metropolitan areas, and that's going to require certain capability that may or may not be available in the state of Kansas, from a Guard perspective. So we look at that to understand what do we need to go ask for in these conferences, and then from that, we can then also, as a force shaping function or force management function, we can also use that type of decision making too, to understand what's the best force structure for the Kansas National Guard to not only, of course, take care of our federal mission, but also that state mission, and be able to respond with the right force structure. So maybe we don't have to necessarily always go out to another partnering state to go request something. An example of that a few years ago was a wildland fire in 2016, I believe it was, where we had to go request from another state some water tender capability, because we really didn't have it in the state of Kansas. We really need to get water out west to western Kansas, to be able to put some of these fires out. And if you can remember, back in 2016, there was a fairly extensive amount of wildland fires that were occurring in western Kansas, and it became a significant event. So we needed to apply the concept of EMAC, because we really didn't have that capability within the state. But we did already have those conversations ahead of time in that conference, to understand what other capabilities we can go after with neighboring states. Last point I want to make on this is that when we do that negotiation and strike up those informal agreements, we look at the FEMA region states first that we're a part of, in this case, Region 7. The next thing we look at beyond that is, are there other contiguous states that are around Kansas, so we can take advantage of, time distance factors and being able to respond fairly quickly. And then finally, if we need a niche capability, we'll look at, going to other states that may have that niche capability. But all that gets rolled up into what we call the chiclet chart that lays out all the capabilities that can be brought back into the EMAC process.
So, sir, that's interesting, because the Army right now is, we're looking at force structure and the balance across the components. And so there's, the war-fighting aspects of the other components of decisive action, and what capabilities you need to be able to do that, and very senior people trying to sort out how you prioritize and make the right call, because changing force structure is not a small thing in terms of cost or effort, retraining, and all of those kinds of things. But it really makes a lot of sense that we would have so much sustainment or transportation, engineers, MPs, chemical soldiers, aviation. Everybody wants aviation, right? And yet we can only afford as an Army so much of it. So I just think that's really fascinating. I'm not sure everybody always remembers that there's always going to be tension between what Compo 1 thinks they're working on for O plans or war plans, and what the states have to deal with in the most likely scenarios on a recurring basis.
This may be a sidebar, but sir, why don't you talk a little bit about the 10+1?
Right, there are 10+1 essential capabilities that we look for, and all those capabilities are things like aviation. Some of the things, Rich, you talked about, aviation, transportation, and we try to marry those up with the FEMA definitions of the lifelines now, I believe it is, that FEMA's went to, which really, there's not a one-to-one relationship between the two, but it really gets back to a capabilities-based type of an event and construct, that you're really having conversations around capabilities and not the eaches. So I need 5 of aviation packages, which may be 5 two-bird packages, with hoists and Bambi buckets or whatever it is, right? And then the associated personnel and all the fuel and everything to sustain them for X amount of time, which costs X amount of dollars. So all that kind of gets rolled together and boiled up together, to build that capabilities package. And that all comes back to that essential plus one. Cyber is, one that we really have begun to focus on in the National Guard. Providing cyber capability to our states, for a lot of different reasons. So that's where the plus one comes from.
And then when you are now out of EMAC resources, now the governor is going to pick up the phone and call the president and ask for help. And that will trigger an emergency declaration or a disaster declaration. Right? If it's something that you can see coming, like a hurricane, often you will hear them use the words emergency declaration when they're talking about the preparation, and that does certain things. It authorizes FEMA to begin moving resources. It authorizes, for example, limited, if they do it, Title 32 money to go to the Guard to mobilize in advance, and it's not going to come out of the state's budget. It authorizes the defense coordinating element for that FEMA region to be activated to begin working with in anticipation of landfall of a hurricane. So there's a lot that goes with that, but it's not a full-blown response. It just allows some smart pre-positioning. In a lot of disasters, the flash to bang isn't 48 to 72 hours, so you don't necessarily go through that. You go straight to a presidential disaster declaration. That turns on the money. That turns on the FEMA spigot. And once the declaration is made, FEMA is in charge. Okay, they are the coordinator at the federal level for all response, and they have directive authority to every single department except one, DOD, to tell them you will do this, and the department will reply with resources in response to a request from the state. DOD gets the right to say no. What that practically means is if you don't have resources because it's deployed overseas on a contingency, you can say no. But if you have it and it's not otherwise being used, DOD will support as well. As a practical matter, not necessarily a legal matter. So we get this disaster declaration from the president. FEMA is mobilizing resources. They turn on what is called a joint field office sometimes, or they run it out of their regional headquarters. They appoint somebody to be in person in charge of the management of that disaster called the Federal Coordinating Officer. That person is appointed by name by the president. Okay? There's a cadre of them nationwide. In fact, I looked at the report this morning. There's 45 of them, I believe, right now, and all but one are committed. Wow. There's only one that's not committed right now, and that's pretty common because there's a lot going on. That person is the individual as the representative of the president who is committing resources, and they will work with the governor and a state coordinating officer who is their fundamental counterpart in the joint field office to make decisions about commitment of resources, i.e. spending money. Okay. Remember 75-25, right? 75 federal, 25 state. The state coordinating officer has the government's mandate to commit state dollars, and the federal coordinating officer is committing the federal dollars and directing who shall respond from the federal government. Okay. There is a third entity you heard me briefly mention before. It's a defense coordinating element. That is an R-North structure. There's 10 of them embedded in the FEMA regions nationwide. They're headed up by a colonel, post-brigade command colonel. They have a small staff and a reserve cadre that mobilizes as needed, so they can go up to 34. Typically, there's about 8 to 10 of them actively engaged that reside in the FEMA headquarters for each region. Okay, they are the ones who are going to vet requests for DoD Title 10 federal support. Okay, not the National Guard support, because that's being handled by General Rueger and his staff. Okay, now there's a lot of coordination that comes with Guard and Title 10 coming, but right now I'm talking about the Title 10 people arriving, and then employing them is a separate conversation. So there's going to be a request to FEMA for capability, and at the Joint Field Office they're going to say, we don't have any non-DOD resources we can apply to this, so let's ask DOD. The DCE, Defense Coordinating Element, they're going to staff and vet that request, and they have a process for doing that. And there's actually statute, which Mr. Gonzales maybe talk about later, that you have to follow to make sure that it's something that DOD can and should do. And then DCO will send a recommendation on that request to Northcom and then into JDOMS, and JDOMS will task one of the components, FORSCOM, the Air Force, the Navy, whatever, to go provide a unit to go do something, okay? And then they get employed in the state. And the normal and customary method of doing that anymore post Hurricane Sandy is going to be under the command and control of a dual status commander, who is typically a National Guard colonel or general officer, depending on the scope and scale, that has been trained to do it, and who will employ both Title 32 and Title 10 forces at the direction of the governor to meet requirements.
Now, I think now that we've gotten to this point, I think it's important that we bring in our staff judge advocate to talk through some of this. So, Mr. Gonzales, now that we've got both federal and National Guard forces working together, could you talk us through the various statutes and titles for soldiers conducting DSCA and how these differ between active duty or federal troops and National Guard?
Yes, the federal troops we often refer to as Title 10, and the National Guard we often refer to as Title 32. And those two abbreviated terms, Title 10 and Title 32, come from the United States Code, so that all the laws pertaining to the active duty force can be found in Title 10 of the United States Code. And all the laws, federal laws pertaining to the National Guard, can be found in Title 32 of the United States Code. And then there's this additional National Guard status called state active duty, and the laws pertaining to National Guard in that status are in state laws. Now, when it comes to DSCA, and you have both Title 10 forces and National Guard forces in the disaster relief effort, the active duty force, the Title 10 forces, are going to be performing what I call just federal missions approved by the SecDef, or in some cases, the Northcom commander. And most of these are going to be, as has been described already, mission assignments that FEMA has generated, and that appropriate ones have been given to the Department of Defense through the Defense Coordinating Officer and Element, and these requests for assistance, these mission assignments, as they are called, have been vetted at the DCO, DCE level. There are several prescripted mission assignments. Well, there are 28 prescripted mission assignments that FEMA and the Department of Defense have agreed to use, and these are basically templates where the capability that FEMA is looking for resides in the Department of Defense. And so instead of FEMA trying to figure out, well, who in the federal government can provide this assistance, that has already been determined. And altogether, there are about 295 pre-scripted mission assignments that are each designated for a particular federal agency. And so the Department of Defense has 28 of those. And a lot of them pertain to aviation assets, transportation assets, logistical assets that reside in the Department of Defense. Now, I heard already that you have raised the subject or the topic of the dual status commander.
Yes,
And so the dual status commander, yes, he has two hats. He has a federal hat and he has a non-federal hat. He holds those two hats, one in each hand, but he can only wear one hat at a time. And so he can put on his federal hat, and when he has his federal hat on, he's going to be commanding all the federal troops that have been OPCON to him. We call that operational control. OPCON to him, and they will be performing the federal missions that either the SecDef or the NORTHCOM commander has approved. And then he can take off that hat and he can put on his non-federal hat, and that's when he is now commanding the National Guard forces, and they will be performing missions, state missions, on behalf of the governor. Now, there's one particular law that we've got to be careful about, particularly with the active duty force, and that is the Posse Comitatus Act.
Mm-hmm.
And that act does not permit federal forces to perform law enforcement functions unless there is a constitutional or an act of Congress exception. Now, that law, the Posse Comitatus Act, does not apply to the National Guard when they are in a Title 32 or state active duty status.
Mm-hmm.
So the National Guard is thus at liberty to perform law enforcement functions according to their state law.
Okay, so that would be the primary difference, we could say, between the Title 10 and the Title 32?
Well, that is, yes, that would be a primary one, and that is why you will rarely see National Guard forces federalized and put in a Title 10 status for a DSCA event, because we, the federal side, we want those National Guard assets to be available to the governor to use to perform state missions and also to perform law enforcement missions if necessary, because that's something that generally, that the active duty force cannot perform.
Okay. Well, and I think that was good that you mentioned the dual status, and I want to go back to that real quick because it is, I think command and control is tricky in these instances. Not only are you dealing with a disaster unfolding, but you're also dealing with, coordination between local, state, federal agencies, National Guard soldiers, possibly federal soldiers. So could you, Mr. Tennant, maybe talk us through the difference between a dual status and a parallel command, and what are the options for commanding and controlling these forces?
Right. So the parallel command is simply the idea that there's going to be one chain of command, one command structure directing the actions of the federal forces, the Title 10. Mm-hmm. And the state will have its own chain of command, and the two are not integrated with each other. They're just carrying out the missions that they're assigned side by side, okay? And frankly, that kind of was the way it was before Sandy. And then after Sandy, we did have this idea of a dual status command, but it was rarely used. After Sandy, the legislation was changed to say that it was the customary and normal way that we were going to provide federal support in the future. I think that's right.
Usually Usual and customary.
Usual and customary.
Usual and customary. Thank you. Post Hurricane Sandy, the Congress enacted legislation which, among other things, said that the usual and customary way that disaster response was going to be provided using DoD resources was under dual status command. And so you will have a commander trained, as we said earlier, and designated to do it. And then that person will have staffs provided, a Title 32 staff typically from the state, and then there's also a Title 10 staff that's provided so that you don't cross matter and antimatter streams, and it includes legal representation for each side, right?
And so where do these two chains come together? Is this in like an emergency ops center, or how do they achieve unity of effort, I guess?
It'll be a JTF constituted by the state for the dual status commander to operate. Okay, and you could have a federal structure backing that up on a very large scale disaster, which includes federal joint task forces and subsidiary forces being OPCON to the dual status commanders in the state under those joint task forces. It starts getting pretty complicated, depending on the scope and scale of it. So a small scale thing, if we were going to provide federal forces to help in Sharon Springs, we'd probably just OPCON them straight to the state's dual status commander, right, who would give them their Title 10 mission requirements, give the Guard its Title 32 mission requirements, but they would be coming from the same person.
Yeah. Well, now, another issue with regards to command and control, and I want to turn this over to General Rueger, is interoperability. And I'm curious, how does the National Guard go about ensuring its forces can operate alongside the civilian and the federal agencies that are not military? Meaning, for example, simple things like being able to talk on the same radios between police and National Guard soldiers, or a medevac pilot being able to talk to firefighters on the ground. Can you talk us through how you guys sort out interoperability, sir?
Absolutely, Chris. Yeah, and that's a good example. I mean, we all have different systems that don't talk to each other. So, it goes back to that common framework that's provided that everyone aligns to. From a common framework, I'm talking about National Response Framework, NIMS, ICS. Utilizing that common framework and common terminology that enables all response forces to be able to understand each other's lexicon. Also, be able to be on the same radio system. So what we've done, for example, for the radio issue, the communication issue, at least from a media means, is to be able to acquire 800 megahertz radios, which allows us to talk to our first responders and others that utilize that. So that's a way to achieve that common interoperability and allow us to communicate. We also put liaisons out there, either get a liaison maybe from a different first responder agency back into the National Guard framework, or we may send a liaison to the incident command post, which is really where all the, at the local level, that's where all of the activity really is generated from with the incident commander, and being able to provide that liaison and communication back into what the National Guard response needs to look like. So, common framework, common processes, integrated systems. We have, our civil support teams that every state has out there. That provides a lot of that communication capability too. We can leverage to allow us to talk to the different networks. Another thing I wanted to bring up is training. Either at the local, state, or national level. We want to exercise these things ahead of time before there's an event. That's what will prove out whether we have an interoperability problem or not. Are we able to communicate with if we have a local Guard organization that is in a particular county seat, building that relationship. Doing some of that local training. We spend a lot of time doing our federal mission training, but we also have to realize that we also have that state mission that we have to train for, and that comes back to building those relationships with those county emergency managers and being able to exercise how this all works so that when we need to be called upon, we don't have issues with the communication. We don't have issues with knowing who the players are and being able to facilitate and make things work very smoothly. So interoperability is key to allowing us to be able to respond effectively as an organization.
And I'm sure you've been put to the test this past year because it seems as though DSCA has taken center stage, as we mentioned earlier. And so I'm curious, sir, if you could maybe talk about some of the big rocks that the Kansas National Guard has been doing this year.
Sure. We have the Kansas Guard has been busy, like everyone has been busy, right? I mean, it's been an unprecedented year. There's a lot of things that are going on. Obviously, COVID is on everyone's mind and still is a big concern for everyone. For the Kansas National Guard, we know we have a large amount of skill sets we can call upon in natural disasters. We've got approximately 7,000 personnel that we can call upon when we need to respond to a disaster. But 2020 has been different. Traditionally, we respond to events that are very episodic in nature. Things like a tornado will come in, and hit a particular community, and we need to go provide some support for a period of time, and then we're out of there, right? Very, very short duration events. Floods sometimes are a little bit longer, but maybe not necessarily requiring a lot of personnel to support those events. We have had, multiple events occur at once where we have multi-hazards that do occur that we need to bring, different resources to bear to attack these disasters a little bit differently, using different capabilities and assets that we have that we're called upon to leverage. So that's certainly kind of what we normally deal with. But this year we've obviously had a tremendous change in how we operate. COVID has caused us to respond at a scale that we've never responded before. I would say probably 15% of our force at any one point in time has been actively working COVID over several months. So it's not only a high demand event, but also long duration, which puts a strain on the force. We at one point in time we had probably 25 active mission assignments from our Division of Emergency Management that we were tasked with. Things like all the way from providing support at the Lansing Correctional Facility to do mobile testing teams or static testing teams out in some communities that just don't have the means to be able to support that type of a thing, to providing delivery of PPE out to the different counties, protective equipment out to the counties for either hospitals, dental offices, or whatever needs to require it. So just a smorgasbord of things that we've had to do. And this isn't just a Kansas, Kansas is one slice of what Guard Nation has had to do. And of course on the federal side too. We all know the response and the magnitude of the response that we had to do. So obviously COVID has been a big thing for us, and obviously the other thing that came into play was just being able to prepare for potential civil unrest, earlier this year too. So we trained up several of our team to with the refresher training on that. Luckily, we didn't have to employ anyone, but that those two things together really did pull a lot of demand on the organization. And then we're actively then sending soldiers to the southwest border to support the southwest border mission with Customs and Border Patrol as well. So if you take a look at all that together, there's a lot of things going on. And then of course being able to also respond. You don't want to focus on the big things and forget about the normal things that are happening. So when there's a flare up on a fire, wildland fire in western Kansas, which there was this year, in the same area, interestingly enough, back to the 2016 area, we've pushed out our aircraft with Bambi buckets and responded, in good fashion for that too, and really lessons learned from 2016, I think, and I think the local EMs really kind of understood what capability that provides. So there's probably a propensity to probably go there quickly to not have a repeat of what happened before. But we can't forget those kind of things either. So we've got a lot of things to balance. Again, that's Kansas view. I know that every state has similar things going on, or even more things going on. So it's been a very active year for us.
Yeah. Well, thank you, sir. I'm curious though, because you do mention these enduring challenges like COVID. I guess, are you planning, or are there plans in the works for you, for the Kansas National Guard, to continue to support future COVID efforts as far as vaccine distribution or whatnot?
Yeah, you know, the first thing we do when we get these mission assignments is we look for an exit strategy, and which is important, right? Because the things we talked about before, we don't want to be doing this for a long period of time, because there's other entities that can pick this up at some point in time, and we want to be able to shift our resources elsewhere and do something different. But we're always there to be counted on, and that's what we do. So when it comes to the vaccination, you know, we like I said before, we've pushed out and supported a considerable amount of mobile testing and static testing teams, just to be able to test in some of the areas across the state of Kansas that where there may be some high density of cases popping up, and we need to have a high throughput. You know, so those counties didn't have the means to do that. So we built this concept, working with our Division of Emergency Management, to put these teams out there to allow the drive-through testing to occur, or, you know, different ways to rapidly push, you know, have a very good large throughput of people through the process. So likewise, I could see that from a vaccination perspective, when a vaccination occurs, you know, we could be called upon to implement a similar construct or something, you know, that will allow us to help with vaccination efforts for areas that may not be able to, you know, have the resources to do it on their own. We haven't been approached yet on that, and we'll just have to see. But, you know, we're certainly ready and willing to jump in there if that's the case.
And, you know, this brings up a very interesting issue with regards to readiness. You know, the National Guard is putting out fires at home and being called on quite frequently, but then you're also deploying soldiers and airmen overseas. How do you balance that readiness, those requirements, sir?
Yeah, that's always a tough one. It kind of goes back to, just to kind of frame up again, we have the dual mission, just to remind everyone, you know, we have a federal mission, we have that state mission. We do most of our training against the federal mission. And really why that is that if we can train our core competencies and do the metal tasks that we do for our federal mission, then it's relatively straightforward to transcend or to really shift those type of tasks over to a domestic support operation for our civilian counterparts. Mm-hmm. So there is a little bit of a nuance to that, though. There is some specific training that we do take, just so there's key personnel that understand the incident command system, they understand NIMS, they understand the national response framework, they understand how to work with our agency partners. You know, so that's a little bit different construct than maybe that everyone's used to. So we need to have that type of training, but a large part of our federal mission training allows us to get after the things that we do to respond within the state. Because driving a truck, you know, and being a transportation unit, you know, whether it's overseas or domestically here, it's a lot of the same tasks, right? So you have that aspect of it. The equipment, you know, we can use the same equipment, and it's dual purpose. We can use for both missions, but we've done some things differently this year that we haven't done before that probably have allowed us to build readiness just with the COVID response. We stood up a JTF for the first time. We had a dual status commander that was approved to be implemented. It was never called upon. Most states, by the way, you know, had dual status commanders that were approved, but only a few that were actually implemented in the construct. But by doing that, we really allowed us to build readiness and do things that we normally hadn't done from a domestic support operation perspective. But back to the federal mission, all the things that we've done with COVID and the other domestic operations we've had to do have pulled away from our federal mission training. So we've had to look at ways to continue to maintain readiness. Mm-hmm. So what do? Well, what we can do is we can look at other opportunities to train. we've had to shift some training to the right because of COVID, but we found innovative ways to still get after it. We had one of our battalions that was getting ready for NTC in 2021. They needed to go through a XCTC validation process this year. We had to scale that back, not because we didn't have the personnel that were being used from a COVID perspective, but because of the COVID situation, we had to maybe not have as many forces together at one point in time. So we came up with an innovative way that allowed us to train some of the tasks at home station, and then work with Fort Riley, who's been a great partner, in all this too, and a long enduring partner of ours with First ID, to be able to send our teams there, do their lanes, their lanes and maneuver lanes, and then be able to, get to a point where the evaluators felt comfortable that we had checked the block and actually were able to be able to conduct operations and prepare for NTC next year. So that's one example, but it's been tough. It's been a strain on the force, but that's when we need to go back to the EMAX again. To kind of circle back to that. If we have a high op tempo deployment year, and we know that we're going to have a lot of forces out of Kansas because of deployments, we may want to go back in that conference again and strike up an agreement to say, hey, if something bad happens in Kansas during this period of time, we may need excess capability from one or two or three states or whatever it is to be able to fill that niche capability that we're leaving behind. So it really goes back to just understanding what the op tempo looks like, save enough excess capacity for unforeseen issues, and then have those agreements in place so that you can execute on those agreements if you need to.
So, a couple of things General Rueger said really resonated in terms of the importance of DSCA to the total Army. And I kind of related back to what the Army Chief of Staff said. He says people are first priority, and it's the people aspect of what you described, sir, that really make a difference. So what is the armed forces, regardless of which component, what do they bring to this? Well, you're bringing cohesive disciplined formations that can execute tasks and that are flexible enough because of the training they have maybe in their core federal metal, or the things that their core state tasks might be. They translate both ways. And then the other takeaway I got from that is many of the things we ask, say, National Guard units to do, we mobilize them and they go and they deploy forward to conduct operations or activities or exercises as part of competition with our peer adversaries. But when you have to make value judgments about what our priorities are, defending the United States of America is part of what DSCA is. I mean, it's a protection function. It's a defense function. And so if you were going to go, and this is just my personal opinion, and rack and stack, what are the most important things that we do? Defending the nation in conflict is always going to be number one. Defending the nation in competition is at least a tie with protecting our own people here, right? That's what the American people expect. So I just think it's kind of neat how, to use a 1950s word, to kind of see how, there's a tension there, but there's benefits from the experience of doing the one that translate into doing the other better, and it works both ways. That's my observation.
Yeah, you're right. There is a tension there, but that's where we have to be smart about it, and let's leverage what we're doing already, to build capability and readiness in both mission sets at the same time, and not try to do both, discreetly. Because it just doesn't make sense to do that, because they do dovetail into each other.
At this point, I just want to point out that, and we often lose sight of this for whatever reason, that there are 4 parts to decisive action. Right. Offense, defense, stability, and defense support of civil authorities. And that sometimes, that last one sometimes doesn't get our full attention until something happens and then we need to shift to it.
Well, I will tell you from firsthand experience early on in COVID, we did a deep dive on all DSCA-related doctrine. In fact, Chris helped do that. Captain Harper helped do that. Ted helped do that, just to inform the senior leaders. And we weren't informing the senior leaders who were actually doing it at NORTHCOM and U.S. Army North. They already knew all that stuff. It was informing the leaders in the rest of the Army who were providing forces, in this case, active duty forces, from within Training and Doctrine Command and Forces Command, to go support the Armed North mission, because most of us just don't spend any time thinking about that unless you're in a job where it's important to do it. And so that was very educational for us in the doctrine world. First, we shouldn't have been surprised that people were going to be interested in it, but the appetite for that was huge. And my guess is there was a lot of peer mentoring going on between the National Guard leadership and the active duty folks who showed up on the ground to help.
And also just to follow on to that too, Rich, I think we likewise looked at internally on this response really has caused us to rethink on how we do response within Kansas. We had a lot of plans on the shelf. We had a pandemic plan, and certainly we used a lot of the pandemic plan, but there's things that happened in COVID that were unprecedented, and so this has been a forcing function for us to go back and relook at these plans again. Foreign animal disease plan, all those plans that we've got out there, and how do we, make it better and learn from this, So I think we've taken away a lot of lessons learned from COVID and made things better. And I think overall the force is going to be better for it.
And so on the subject of these current events, as DSCA is taken, is front and center right now, I want to bring Mr. Gonzales back in because I'd like to talk briefly about the border support mission that both federal and National Guard troops have been supporting for quite some time. And Mr. Gonzales, I'm hoping that you can explain both under what title and authority these soldiers are generally working, and then what kind of support they're providing down there.
I'll be glad to do that. Federal forces have been on the border since late October of 2018. And SecDef approval, has been obtained to continue this support until the end of this fiscal year, which will be September 30th of next year. Now, on its face, when you look at what's going on the border, I know just from personal experience, individuals have approached me and have expressed the thought that federal troops are doing law enforcement type of activity that's prohibited by the Posse Comitatus Act. Mm-hmm. And while that may be the optics, here is what is going on. There is a statute. It's called the Military Support to Civilian Law Enforcement Agencies Act of 1981. And it's found in Title 10, United States Code, Section 271 and 274. And recall that I said earlier, all the federal laws pertaining to the active duty force are in Title 10 of the United States Code. And these particular sections 271 to 274, are a act of Congress exception to the Posse Comitatus Act. And it allows the Secretary of Defense to approve what is called indirect passive support to civil law enforcement agencies. And so, of course, the Customs and Border Protection is a federal law enforcement agency. Mm-hmm. And so they are the direct recipient of the support that DOD is providing. So none of our federal soldiers are performing what is called active direct law enforcement, such as an arrest, apprehension, a search, a seizure, interrogation. We are not doing that type of activity at all. Instead, we are doing indirect passive support, and specifically, we are providing engineers to repair barriers or install new barriers or fencing. We are providing medical personnel to screen migrants to see if they have any disease or any injuries. And so these are the main functions that we have been providing and that we are providing. And as I said, we will continue to provide until September of next year. And so all of that comes under Section 271, 274 of Title 10 of the United States Code.
Now, sir, you mentioned exceptions to posse comitatus, and I kind of want to talk about the most well-known exception to Posse Comitatus Act, and that's the Insurrection Act. Can you talk us through the Insurrection Act and what it, enables and both constrains?
The Insurrection Act is, there is a provision in the Constitution that I think it's Article 4 of the Constitution, Article 4, Section 4 of the Constitution that provides for federal response to any domestic violence. And pursuant to that Section 4 of Article 4, Congress passed the Insurrection Act. And it gives the president, and only the president, the authority to use federal forces to assist the state in restoring and maintaining law and order. There are three circumstances where this support can be provided. And very simply, and I failed to mention, again, this is also, because this is an act that pertains to the federal force, it's found in Title 10 of the United States Code, specifically Sections 251 to 254. And so the three circumstances where the president can provide federal forces to restore law and order is very simply when there's an insurrection against state authority, when there is number two, when there's an insurrection against U.S. authority, or number three, when the insurrection is depriving a class of citizens of their constitutional rights and the state is either unable or unwilling to protect those rights. So
that would be like President Eisenhower's use of federal troops to desegregate the Little Rock schools, for example, that last incident?
Exactly. Exactly. And I know that probably maybe I'm the only one who was alive back in 1956 in this group who was able to witness what was going on in Little Rock, Arkansas, in the federal court order to integrate the public high school. And so in that case, we could go either with the second basis or the third basis for invoking the Insurrection Act. And as you may recall, I said the second basis was there was an insurrection against U.S. authority. And in that case, the U.S. authority was a federal district court order. And so there were individuals in the streets in Little Rock who were opposing that order and not allowing that order to be implemented. So the president could have used the second basis, or he could have used the third basis, which is there was a class of citizens, these high school students, who were being deprived of their constitutional rights, in this case, a public education, and the state of Arkansas was unwilling to protect those rights. And so the president invoked the Insurrection Act, President Eisenhower. Now, In either one of those three cases, there is a predicate here that the president has to satisfy, and that is he has to issue a proclamation to all those who are disrupting the normal course of business, and basically order them to cease and desist and to return to their homes peacefully. And if they don't do that within a specified period of time, then that's when the president can invoke the Insurrection Act. Now, that provision about the proclamation does not specify how much time the president has to give. That is totally within his discretion. And so he may give a matter of days if he chooses, or it could be as little as a matter of hours, depending on the circumstances. Now, there have been, you mentioned the Little Rock, Arkansas situation, but there have been two more recent.
Yeah, could you tell us about those?
Yes, when the Insurrection Act's been invoked, both times by the first President Bush, and I'm going to guess that most individuals may remember the Los Angeles riots. In the aftermath of the virtual acquittal of all charges against the several police officers who beat up Rodney King. And there was a massive reaction in the city towards that acquittal that encompassed square miles of property within Los Angeles. And the governor of California requested federal assistance under the first basis. This was an insurrection against state authority, and it was state actors who were requiring individuals to stop their rioting or what have you, and they were just simply refusing. So when there is this situation involving state authority, the state legislature has to do the requesting for assistance unless they're not in session. And then if they're not in session, then it would be the governor. So at the time of the LA riots, the California legislature was not in session, and so Governor Wilson asked for assistance.
I got you. Thank you for that, sir. Now, Mr. Tennant, when we were talking about the border mission, did you have something to add to that?
Well, I will say that I think we were discussing just the current actions that are ongoing under the Presidential Emergency Declaration, which then sent active DoD forces to support CBP. But there's a second piece to this, and there is a standing joint task force which has been in operation since 1989, providing support in a counter-drug authority, using the same statutory authorities that Mr. Gonzales discussed, 271 through 284. It's extended a little bit beyond what he was discussing for them. And this is JTF North, formerly known as JTF 6. And since they're still active and they're still providing support in the counter-drug effort, and their mandate has actually been increased following 9/11 to include transnational threats and operations against transnational organized crime. And so that, even absent the current emergency declaration, which took federal forces down to the border, federal forces often go to the border to do JTF North missions as well. And so the same kind of constraints apply. They have to be very concerned with intelligence oversight regulation, with the restrictions against the direct participation in any law enforcement activity. The categories of missions that he discussed are appropriate. At one point, I was the JTF engineer down there, and we did a lot of road construction, fence construction, and lights construction for the U.S. Border Patrol between the ports of entry, and that goes on to this day. And actually, they employ all three components at various times doing various missions along the southwest border of the United States, to include detection and monitoring, to include aerial reconnaissance, so we don't need to forget that it's not just this current emergency declaration, which
It's nothing new.
involves
Yeah.
federal. I mean, we've been doing it for a very long time, and it is not, in fact, as was pointed out, a posse comitatus violation. It's just governed under the statute that is an exception, and it's very specifically laid out in those, actually both in those parts of Chapter 15 of Title 10, but also it's typically in the NDAA every year as well.
Well, I'm just amazed by the diversity of the DSCA mission, to be honest. When we everything we've talked about today, it's astounding in how much our soldiers and airmen do to do this mission set.
Yeah, that kind of reminds me of the conversations we have in the doctrine world all the time. Is people act like something's new when really it's new to them, or new to us, because we just haven't been exposed to it.
Well, gentlemen, on that note, did we miss anything? Did we leave anything out? I think we covered quite a few bases today.
I guess, since this is a doctrine podcast, the one thing that I kind of came back to is what makes DSCA doctrine unique is that, one, it's very prescriptive. Most doctrine is not. Most elements of doctrine are not prescriptive, but it is because of its linkage to policy and how the Army supports civilian authorities. That's one. And two, that maybe all of us should spend a little bit more time paying attention to it, given the contemporary operating environment that we're in. Because if we haven't dabbled in DSCA in our careers up to this point, the chances of it are probably pretty high sometime in the future, particularly for the younger members of the force.
And I will tell you that, from my perspective, the legal implications have to be known. You definitely need to understand the legal implications, as well as authorities and status of what status you're in, what authorities you're under. So there is definitely that aspect of it that leadership and those that are in the trenches doing this need to understand what their left and right limits are, because it is very prescriptive.
Well, gentlemen, on that note, I think we'll wrap things up. Thank you for joining me today. I'd also like to thank our listeners and note that the views and opinions expressed in this podcast do not necessarily reflect the official position of the United States Army, the United States Army Training and Doctrine Command, Army North, the Kansas National Guard, or the Combined Arms Center. I'm Major Chris Parker, and this is Breaking Doctrine.